All right, I am thrilled to be moderating this panel today and continue the discussion about ocean acidification and also the current state of environmental journalism. As many of us can attest, we have lots of journalists in the room. It's not an easy time to tell these big, complex stories. It requires a lot of resources and effort to fully understand the issues, and then additional resources to put together an attractive package that engages readers along web, print, broadcast, and mobile platforms. Of course, new technologies are creating interesting ways for journalists to tell these stories, but also scientists and the public to collect and disseminate information. So our panelists today are all navigating these changes as they try to redefine environmental storytelling. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce them. You've already met a couple of them, our prize winners, Steve Ringman and Craig Welch. Of course, they won their work, the award for their work together at the Seattle Times, where Steve has been a photographer for almost 25 years. So this is not Steve's first awards rodeo. His photos of environmental issues have been honored several times, most recently by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and that was for his coverage of the Elwha River Dam's removal. And as Jim mentioned, he was also part of the team that won the 2009 Knight-Risser Prize for a report on how aggressive logging was contributing to landslides. Now, I understand also you started your career here in the Bay Area, is that right?
I worked at the Chronicle. In fact, Steve Castillo and I worked together. And I worked there for about 15 years and started in Antioch. And, so, yeah.
The sun was too much for you.
Well, I was from the Pacific Northwest, so I made it home.
Right. And then until recently, Craig was also at the Seattle Times as an environment reporter, but a couple of months ago, he took a new job at National Geographic magazine as a contributing writer on the environment. Congratulations. And even though he said neither of them are particularly brave, his bio says that during his 2 decades-long award-winning journalism career, he shadowed Alaska Native seal hunters, flown over the Arctic in helicopters, and tracked endangered owls in Oregon.
I'm still not brave, though.
Sounds pretty impressive to me. Next, we have Ken Caldeira. He's a senior climate scientist at the Carnegie Institution for Science here at Stanford. That means his job is to, quote, make important scientific discoveries. Sounds like a big deal. He's also an environmental science professor here by courtesy, and his research has raised awareness of threats related to ocean acidification and carbon dioxide emissions. I believe, Craig, earlier you said, make sure you get in there that he's the godfather of ocean acidification. Is that right?
He kind of is.
And he has also served on several national and intergovernmental panels about climate change. Thank you for being here. And then finally, we're joined by Mary Ellen Hannibal. Mary Ellen is an author and editor who writes about science and culture. Her work sheds light on mass extinctions and how human development isolates animals into island-like habitats on land. She was part of the team that won the 2012 Knight-Risser Prize for tracing the lengthy migration of one of the fastest land animals in North America. Her books include The Spine of the Continent. And, yes, the pronghorns.
The fastest.
The fastest. Her books include, I saw some debate online, so I just wasn't sure.
Well, there's a faster animal, but not in North America.
Okay. And her books include The Spine of the Continent and a forthcoming overview of citizen science. All right, so let's go ahead and kick off the conversation. So Steve and Craig, I'm really curious. You mentioned all of the work that went into the reporting. You mentioned all the team at the Times. And I was just wondering, you said that the editors wanted a big story. It sounded like your editors were interested, but there was this question of, maybe we don't have the money, can you look for outside money? Can you talk a little bit more about the grant, maybe how big it was, how much of a difference it made in terms of what you were able to do? What would the story look like without it?
I'm not sure there would be one.
We wouldn't have traveled, I don't think, which is expensive.
Yeah, so we had basically told our editors that we thought that what we needed to do is take a global look at this problem, which you can't do from your desk in Seattle. And they were like, great, find us some money. And they didn't just sort of step back and let us do it. They were helpful, and they wanted it to happen. We literally just sent the Pulitzer Center a proposal, and I think this story had not gotten a lot of attention, 3 years ago, and I think people were eager to hear something about it. So we got a grant for $12,000, which was basically just for the two of us to go to Papua New Guinea on a dive boat and dive for 10 days. And then later in the year, we rolled these stories out not all at once. And later in the year, we ended up going back to Indonesia to focus on this community, and they were willing to give us more money because they were happy with the results of the previous version. Pulitzer Center only funds journalism, and their mission is to fund journalism that is undercovered and international. So it's a perfect fit for a story like this.
And I think that it kind of set a precedent in our newsroom that this is the new norm. If you are thinking in terms of large projects, outside money has to be thought of also.
Mm-hmm. And the Pulitzer Center also expected an investment from the Seattle Times. And the Seattle Times, they certainly gave us our time, paid for our time, and they put money toward us going to Alaska, and a lot of staff time and resources. They bought this underwater camera so Steve could use. But, I think once the Pulitzer Center got on board, a lot of editors in the newsroom were like, oh, this must be a big deal. We should do something like this.
They weren't trying to sway the story in any way whatsoever.
Yeah, they didn't do anything other than say, can we be helpful? If so, let us know.
Yeah,
so there was
give
no
us credit
influence.
in the end. Yeah.
And do you know why? Why do you think that the story wasn't getting a lot of attention before? I mean, the Seattle Times steps up. I mean, really, the story could have been done by newsrooms all over the planet. Why wasn't it getting attention?
There's nothing to see. I mean, I think it's esoteric. I mean, if you think about it, we went and pitched to our bosses a multi-part global series about chemistry. And, that's not the sexiest thing in the world. And I think, there's nothing to see. We're talking about the future. It's complicated. It's not clear what it's going to be.
The way it was presented, I mean, a story like this that appears in the paper or online, it would be really easy for a reader to ignore. But we sunk enough into it with our site that it impacted the viewers and the readers.
Yeah.
And Ken, why don't you jump in here? And I understand that this was even a process to get journalists to pay attention. I mean, then they had the process of getting their editors and the public on board. But can you talk a little bit about how ocean acidification became a topic that these two guys would cover?
Well, I guess my involvement with this came with a call from Craig, and I guess he started discussing this topic, and I guess I explained my understanding of it, and I think gave the names of other people who you should talk to.
But you've been talking about it for years, wondering why we weren't doing
Yeah,
it.
so there had been scientists working on this issue, say in the late 1990s. Joni Kleypas is one, but they had been talking about decreasing ocean carbonate saturation states and kind of using language that was hard for the average person to fathom. And so I and other people started describing it in terms of ocean acidification, which we felt was a way that people could understand the issue more easily. And then that, I think, helped to catch on. And really, Elizabeth Colbert, who did a piece in The New Yorker, I think in 2005 or 2006, which was the first popular presentation of it. And what's interesting as a scientist, the press has become important in the process of doing science now, because there's such a glut of scientific publications that scientists don't know what to read. And so when there's press attention to an issue, it actually influences what scientists work on. And so Elizabeth Colbert writing that story, or Craig and doing this story, helps also focus scientific attention on the problem. So.
Interesting. And Mary Ellen, you bring in yet another layer into this. You work a lot with the public and citizens. And I'm just wondering, how do citizen scientists play in? You also work with traditional media. Could you talk a little bit about how these intersect?
Well, a lot of citizen science is me also hanging out with PhD scientists. So it's a kind of an interesting thing. Just right now, you guys are probably all well aware, as you guys are, that there's this massive sea star wasting disease going on all down the coast from Alaska to Baja. It's the biggest mortality in the intertidal that's been registered by humans. It's possible it's happened before we were watching. But from a journalism perspective, so there's this story, the sea star wasting, and now it's been identified that there's a virus that's causing it. but we don't know why the sea star has become vulnerable to it right now. Is it something else going on in the water? And you'll see, this great big feed out there of people putting forth their, it's the nuclear waste, it's ocean acidification, it's global warming, it's the end of the world. But there's a real frustration. I wonder about how you might address this well, as a scientist, you can't say ocean acidification may have something to do with this, or it is more this or less that.
I think as a scientist, often you can say ocean acidification may have something to do with it. It's when you go to remove the word may that it becomes more complicated. I think the way most scientists think about it is that organisms are subject to multiple stresses, and so there's coastal pollution, and there's overfishing, and there's global warming, and there's ocean acidification, and so each of these stressors make it harder for organisms to live. And exactly partitioning, what the relative importance of these different factors is really hard in a natural environment. And I think this kind of, for the scientists and also for the journalists, this makes it difficult because the scientists can't come out and say, oh yes, the sea star problems are caused mostly by ocean acidification or something. There's just not evidence for something like that. But you can say, well, there's evidence that ocean acidification adversely impacts echinoderms, of which sea stars are a type, and so there's evidence that ocean acidification would be harmful to these organisms. But then the challenge for the journalist is, how do you take that kind of weaselly worded scientist talk and say it in a way that the average person can read it and make sense of it?
Well, and let's talk about that a little bit.
I think one of the luxuries we had in this particular case was that my direct supervisor is a former environmental reporter. So unlike some newsrooms you might find, he embraced complications. The idea that you could actually write in stories, we know this, this, and this, but we don't know what it means yet. He was totally comfortable with that. And that sort of freed us up to actually not, we had to find the edge of things. We had to find out, what do we know about sea stars, for example, and what don't we? But we could say, what are some of the possibilities and why are they realistic possibilities? And we could do that in these stories. And I think the public was really grateful to have an honest discussion where it's okay to say, here's what we do know, here's what we don't know.
It's not definitive.
Yeah, and it's not definitive. And that's in part because we just had a boss who was not urging us to say something that we couldn't say yet.
So in addition, I'm sorry, Ken, did you want to jump in there?
I think the average person understands the concept of risk. And so if you say there's evidence that this is harmful to sea stars, the sea stars are dying, there's the risk that our continued CO2 emissions will make things worse. I think the average person can get that. I don't think not everything has to be a completely nailed down, cut and dry story to be worth communicating to the average person.
And I think one of the things that was particularly effective about what you guys did in your story is for the average person, you used more than words, and a lot more than words. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about all of the things that your package entailed and what that did in terms of getting the message out, reaching the public.
If you want to know why it worked, it's this guy.
Well, you want to be able to place people in the situations that we were in, and so obviously multimedia helps. But just thinking back at that when we showed that video of the guy standing there talking about the bubbles, and the fish aren't around the bubbles anymore, and so Craig and I literally walked out of the boat, walked up the beach, and I had my 5D, and we just walked up to this guy and asked him. And it was just this simple way of using a tool in order to place people here into Papua New Guinea in order to communicate. And I think that's really helpful, for one thing.
Yeah, we were, Steve had been shooting video for a couple, he's a fabulous still photographer, been doing it for 30 years. He'd been shooting video for a couple years, never shot underwater. I'd never done any kind of TV interviews. I didn't know the first thing about
we did stand-ups.
how you do stand-up interviews on camera. So, I think part of it was the willingness to embarrass ourselves. And we got to, we just did a lot of stuff. And when we came back, we threw a lot of raw material at editors video editors who were really good at putting it together.
We would have interviewed you if we'd come down.
Yeah,
come down here.
yeah, because we needed you on camera.
Yeah.
But I think having so many people, I mean, everybody in the newsroom who was involved in this project recognized that it was valuable, that it had scope, and it was like everybody had their own piece to be excited about. So we had video editors who had been itching to, like, they're not getting to do big explanatory stuff, and it's like, well, we've got one for you. So I think there were a lot of things that sort of came together and gelled at the same time.
And you also employed outside sites, Reddit, right? You did blogs, all kinds of other things in addition to follow up.
Yeah, we basically had social media people say, do this, and we did everything they asked us to do, just because we're like, we want people to find it, and it was just embracing every opportunity we had.
I have a question for you guys. I'm really kind of perplexed that your readership did not take it to respond more to the local impacts of the oysters, and then it took like going around the world for them to wake up and look at the issue almost as if it were something easier to absorb if it was farther away.
Well, the oyster industry responded. I mean, we covered in the collapse of the oyster problem in Willapa Bay, but they responded by creating hatcheries in Hawaii and continuing to have their larvae grow in Hawaii, and then every day they'd FedEx it back to Willapa Bay, and so they solved their problem in essence that way. So people were still getting their Kumamotos and all their great oysters, and I think that out of sight, out of mind happened in that sense. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I also think everybody cares about something different. I mean, we all use the ocean for different things, and if you don't particularly care about oysters, it might be easy to dismiss. But if you care about
King crab
or fish or communities that rely on all these things, or coral reefs, if you give people the breadth of what's at stake, I think you might have a better chance. I think it was less that it was local than it was just one specific problem.
Right.
I have a question. That when you do these multimedia things on the web, you're no longer just reaching a Seattle audience, but you're reaching a national and international audience. And how important is that to your editor and publisher?
Well, you want your stories to have legs, which means you want it to go out into the public, and you want it to not just stay in Seattle, even though that's our market is Seattle. You want it to go national and international, which this story did. And I think even now, a couple of years later, people still are coming back to Sea Change as the acidification story. But, of course, our publisher, who's a great guy, it's a family paper, something like this does mean a lot to him. And it means a lot to us, too, that it's still being looked at. There's a lot of hits still happening. We can see where, who's coming to the website for different things. And yes, people are still coming back to Sea Change.
Yeah.
I don't know if I answered your question.
But I think a little bit of being on the left coast, I mean, I think
Yes.
we tend to have a little bit of a chip on our shoulder that
Up and out
that
there.
the powers that be that run the country don't ever pay any attention to anything. And I think it's always helpful to know that, like, hey, you're missing this and we're on it. And I think it
New York Times.
So, but I mean, I think our editors, that they like to know that we're on top of things in a way that somebody might be missing, and I think that helps more than getting a reader in Germany or something.
And Mary Ellen, would you mind talking a little bit about your work with citizen scientists in the sense that, I'm not sure how are you getting the word out to them? How are they getting back to you?
So citizen science is a really interesting thing, I think, for journalism to look at in general, because there's some interesting kind of intersection points. So citizen science is just regular people contributing to scientific research. And where scientists are sort of uniformly would agree that citizen help is useful is in collecting observations that can be uploaded to gigantic databases that are in use by scientists all over the world. And so the blue ribbon, blue chip standard bearer for this is eBird. Citizen scientists, regular people just making observations of where they see birds when, date, time, latitude, longitude, uploading to this eBird database, have made almost 200 million observations of birds around the globe. This is an enormous, over time snapshot of how nature is functioning around the whole globe. And what's interesting about citizen science is it's just burgeoning field everywhere. There was just a citizen science conference in San Jose 2 weeks ago, which I went to, of course. It was the second one, and there were 300 people on the waiting list to get into it. This is a scientific conference. It's very, very popular because it is felt, rightly, that this is a way to engage the public in understanding and participating in environmental issues at different scales, local, regional, and global. But what I think eventually I would love to see is, individual communities, or like the Seattle Times, having a database that's like a weather report on the Seattle Times, and you have the weather, but then you also have who are the birds flying over, what are the whales in the ocean right now, what are the sea stars doing right off the coast, and you have citizens putting that data into this database and then observing it themselves, and then with the social networking dimension where people can talk about it. So an interactive newspaper, if you would, but also monitoring not just the community as we define it as of people, but as Aldo Leopold defined the community, which is the creatures that share this earth with us, and also the geological formations that are part of it too. There's a lot of seismic citizen science going on where people are reporting earthquakes all day long. So that's citizen science in a kind of big, broad overview.
And what do you think stopping us from, having this interactive?
I think it's getting there. I mean, it's a new thing. There's some big problems. One is that data, to really be useful across different kinds of scales, has to be collected in a uniform way. So there's all the citizen science projects out there, and they're not all collecting their data in the same way. There's an agreement, like we have to get there, but they're not there yet. That's a big thing. And from my point of view as an environmental reporter, I see the citizen science education is excited about it, science is excited about it, but often forgetting that if we don't connect the citizen science to conservation outcomes, then we're just monitoring going to hell in a handbasket with good data points on that. But that gets to me to my big question for Ken, which is, how long do we have here in the ocean, and what are we going to do about this? Before
it's all on you.
Just a small question.
And you have the answer, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a big range of sensitivities of different organisms, and I think coral reefs are among the most sensitive, and that's some of what I study. And there's just a huge amount of uncertainty of exactly what is global warming and ocean acidification going to do, and what is what is overfishing and so on doing. And so, my own view is that we need to stop building things with smokestacks and tailpipes now, and that these sort of gradualistic economic optimization type approaches aren't going to get us to where we need to be. And so, but anyway, I'm sort of further on that spectrum than most people. And so, my view is that every CO2 emission, or for that matter, every bit of coastal pollution, is additional damage to the system, and it's already damaged enough. And so I think there's no time to lose.
Not to put you on the spot, but I thought you and I heard you once say that, we have a couple of decades, at most, before we start seeing, if we don't do something dramatic.
Yeah, well, we've written a paper, and one of my postdocs is in the audience. I have to keep honest over here. But we've written a paper saying that, if current emission trends continue, that there'll be no sustainable coral reefs left by mid-century or so, which doesn't mean they'll die off right then, but that their days are numbered, and so that's only 35 years away, and emissions are increasing, and so while there might be a few decades left for the most sensitive systems to kind of be unsustainable, if to avoid that kind of outcome, we really need to start transforming our energy system now. So, but on the, well, I don't want to get completely depressing. It is also the case that every emission avoided, I don't think it's like, oh, well, it's gone, we're emitting CO2, and so we're not going to stop emitting today, and so it's pointless to do anything. That my perspective is that every emission causes additional damage, and that any emission we can avoid is a good thing. And so I don't necessarily think of like how many decades do we have. It's sort of how much damage can we avoid doing.
And there's, of course, more pressure on the environment than simply carbon emissions. We all have this habitat fragmentation. You referenced this other work that I've spent a lot of time on, which is extinction. And we're in a sixth mass extinction where plants and animals are disappearing at a rate and magnitude equaling that which took out the dinosaurs. And the main driver of that is probably, in an occult way, the carbon global warming, but it's also habitat loss. And and then there's fantastic researchers here at Stanford about how researching how humans are using up too much photosynthesis. We use up so much photosynthesis, we don't leave enough energy power from the sun for other creatures. So we have a big suite of, and then of course those forces intersecting with these ocean acidification forces, we don't even quite know what kind of unholy roller coaster that could snowball into.
Let me just support this. My view is that on land, most of the extinctions have been the result of use of land and conversion of land. And in oceans, most of the damage is probably overfishing and coastal pollution. But over time, the CO2 accumulates, and so those are becoming more important over time. But really, just how we use the land and how we use the ocean today is also critically important.
Well, Steve, Craig, and Mary Ellen, when you have all these catastrophic things that you're talking about, how do you decide how to set the tone in your stories so that, like you were saying, Mary Ellen, it's not just we're going to hell in a handbasket. How do you decide to set the tone?
Well, just listening, I mean, a reader will either blow their brains out or they'll just ignore it. But yeah, I mean, Craig, that's what, as a writer, did such a great job because he drew people in and didn't just like, oh man, the world is ending. So it is really the way you write it, I think, and show it and present it. That's a small part of it.
Yeah, we had a lot of discussion in our newsroom where editors were like, well, it's not going to be all bad, is it? I'm like, well, it's pretty bad. And they kept saying, well, we want people to actually feel motivated to change. I'm like, I'm doing the best I can. So at one point, I mean, we did do an entire story that was what can be done, and and we tried to lay out that there are a lot of things that individuals can do. Most of them can affect things on a small scale, unless they're looking to do sort of motivate political change. And that's just, I think, the reality, unless...
Yeah, I was going to say, there are some people who think that evolutionary adaptation happens much faster than most people believe. So there's a chance that Darwin could get us out of some of this. But
fingers crossed.
I mean, so Ken just sat on a panel over the last couple of years looking at geoengineering and whether or not this is something that can actually be helpful or not. And some of the folks who were on that panel have said, there is this hope that, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, we will see new ways of doing things that might help, or, we can do sort of grand scale changes. But
I was actually on the phone with some Senate staffers of a senator today talking about these issues from, I don't want to say who it's from just because I don't want to be in the newspaper. So but they were asking about these things, and I said, well, look, you could maybe, protect a reef in an enclosed bay, but the idea that you're really going to do some massive engineering thing to correct the chemistry of the whole ocean is not really practical. And so,
well, it's like somebody said that one of the things you could do is you could put, calcium carbonate into the ocean. And so I actually called a guy at Ocean Science Trust and said, what would that take? And he said, well, how many White Cliffs of Dover do you think we have? And he's basically like, you need like multi-scale numbers of those to
But,
basically
I
put
mean,
it in the
we've been
sea.
doing experiments over the last couple of years in Australia looking at these things. And the idea that you might be able to protect a bay or something like that might be feasible, but the idea that you're going to protect the ocean ecosystems is just unreasonable.
Well, citizen science, this is why I'm writing a book about it, is because I think it does really hold out. It's not just, and it's not just that it has this potential to really galvanize people, but also it is a different way a science has evolved of doing with big data. And a lot of science uses big data now as looking at, one thing citizen science does takes, NASA has satellites going around the globe taking pictures of the Earth and can see when certain things are photosynthesizing. It's this unbelievable scale that they can actually take pictures of deforestation, as we know, fires, clear cutting, but also when, say, an invasive weed is photosynthesizing, which can pinpoint the exact time to go in there with your herbicide to get that invasive plant. But that has to be ground truthed by citizen scientists saying, this is exactly where that buffalo grass is. So, and then I think once you get people out there helping make solutions, I think that this will be catching. And I hold out a lot of hope for this because I feel like young people really get this and they're open to shaping their world in a way. After a certain point, we're all kind of locked into our jobs and our cars. We don't know how to not get into the car because we have to go to our job. But they are more flexible, and I think there's really hope for some quick cultural evolution.
I had one of the scientists we talked to in the series talk about Arab Spring as if that's sort of like a metaphor for the way major change happens. That one day this snowball reaches a pinnacle and suddenly everybody is thinking about doing things differently. I mean, I feel like in the last 5 years, the way people talk about climate change has actually changed dramatically. I don't know if you feel that, but I mean, it seems like it's gone from, is it real to, of course it's real. And, I feel like these changes can happen rather quickly once they do.
Yeah, I mean, I used to, 5 or 10 years ago, I would have focused more of my effort on trying to talk to the staffers of the senator, and now I would like to focus more of my effort, and have been focusing more of it in helping people like Craig write good stories, because I think that solving the sort of climate, ocean acidification, energy problem depends on reaching the average person and making the average person care about these issues and feel they can do something about it. And that happens, and the vehicle to communicate to the broad audience is through journalists. And we don't really get to control the message, but we can help you craft your message. And so I see that as really the most effective way that I can be politically active right now.
And Craig, you mentioned that one of the stories was a solutions-oriented piece. Did you find that helped elevate, the story, help it stand out a little bit more? I mean, obviously we're hearing about a lot of different environmental issues as news consumers, and how do you help elevate one in someone's mind, or did the solutions-oriented approach seem to work?
I don't know. I mean, I know the one thing that I was happiest with finding is there's this, I'm blanking on his name now, I'm sorry to say, but this conservative congressman from South Carolina who just lost his seat, who was out as basically this evangelist for a carbon tax. And he was basically going around the country trying to convince other conservatives that a carbon tax is actually a conservative principle. And it was interesting to find how he sort of framed that as not in any way a challenge to his principles, but like right front and center. And I think in some ways it's just like sort of throwing up ideas at people and saying, this is not, it doesn't have to be a political, ideological spat. It's just, here are some potential things that could work. And it was nice to see that it's not just like a bunch of lefties talking about what they think they can do, but like, there are people on both sides of the aisle that can come up with answers.
One thing about this kind of story is this whole multimedia web aspect of it, because I mean, newspapers that used to be, like the Rolling Stones, like who needs yesterday's news? And whereas a story like this lasts, and that there's a kind of, it's not quite permanent, it's probably saying too much, but there's a long-lasting quality and this kind of cross-platform.
It's accessible.
Accessible, and I'm sure there's many schools that they're getting assigned to watch this and so on. And so these kind of stories, I think, have much more impact. If it was just on the front page of the Seattle Times and then disappeared, it wouldn't have had the same impact that it had.
One of the things that the Pulitzer Center does when you get grant money from them is they extract a commitment from you to go and talk to schools. And so I'm going later this month to St. Louis to do 7 talks a day for 3 days to schools in St. Louis to basically give presentations about ocean acidification. And I feel like I'll do any one that they want to send me to, because it wouldn't happen without them, and it's sort of getting young people and college kids. And I think every little bit helps.
And for the two of you, how have the successes and failures of Sea Change maybe changed the way the Seattle Times does business or approaches a story, or even for the two of you, does it do anything different in terms of how you might approach a journalist or how you might cover a story? But just starting with you, did lessons learned, has it made any permanent changes at the Times?
Well, I mean, one of the things they did is we had such a rinky-dink website, just sort of engineering-wise, that they actually had to build all of this as its own website and then pipe it through seattletimes.com to make it work. But now they have this template where you can do this sort of interesting visual display, and they've been using it and manipulating it and changing it for all these other stories since then. And so I think we're sort of doing a lot more video and moving stuff because they invested it here, and they invested it here in part because they were so excited about all the images Steve came back with. I mean, I think that was the thing that really made all the difference, is that Steve came back with so much powerful stuff that covered such a broad spectrum that it gave them the opportunity to try new things. And
we've expanded.
Yeah.
We've hired video editors, a couple more. And when you mentioned solutions journalism, we've jumped on that with our education beat. And that's proved to be, pretty valuable as far as what people can see could happen with journalism, rather than just bringing up the negativity of issues. But I wouldn't say that we operate in any other way that's different as journalists after having experienced and gone through Sea Change, except that it takes not a village, but it takes a newsroom to create that. But now, like Craig says, there is a template that we can move on with other stories and communicate in that same way.
Well, we want to give folks in the audience a little opportunity to ask you guys some questions as well. We have a microphone standing in the center there if anybody would like to come up and ask a question of our esteemed panel. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Heather Hudson. I have been based here, but I've worked in Alaska as well, and the communication side as a professor. But I'm from Vancouver in the Northwest, so I thought, gee, did anyone in Vancouver read your story? But I guess my question is exactly that. What kind of reaction did you get from readers of the subscribers to the paper as a paper who could then access online, and from others who found the story somehow? Did you get feedback? Can you say anything about the range of geographically where the responses came from, as well as different kinds of people or different backgrounds of readers and viewers?
Well, the Pacific Northwest is very, very hip to environmental news, especially on the west side of Washington State. And so lots of response, lots of people knowing that it's an issue. I mean, a lot of people didn't even know what OA acidification was, and now it was a way to educate as well as bring them to this issue. So lots of positive comments.
I know that there were a couple of people who made presentations using some of Steve's photos as giant poster board on the floor of the U.S. Senate, And I know that there were a couple of UN panels, and some recently, in recent months, in places like Vienna, that were making references to sea change. So I think it was getting in front of the eyes of people who have the ability to make things happen. And we also, I mean, we got, you know, emails and stuff in social media from around the world, and you know, it was well received. I think in part because it was so easy to get through because of all the visual elements.
Yeah, was there ever an issue or question of putting this behind a paywall? Because sometimes I'll help a journalist on a story, and then after, then it's done, and then it's behind a paywall, and then nobody can read it.
And you have to pay to read your own words.
Yeah, well, or just that nobody else can read it is more what I'm. And so, was there ever a question of like, should this be behind a paywall or not?
I don't think it ever came up. I think, you know, I think we're like every media outlet. We're sort of experimenting with paywalls, but I think they knew that if we're going to invest this time and money and resources to do something this big, we want everybody who has even the slightest interest to have a chance to look at it.
And we're trying to figure it out. We're trying to make a buck still in the news business, but paywalls, you know, they are successful on a daily basis. But to block a project like Sea Change, that would have been a crime, I think.
Additional questions?
This is actually for Craig and Steve. So, as you've noted, even 5 years ago, a for-profit company like the Seattle Times taking money from getting grant money from a nonprofit, it wouldn't even have been considered. So, I just wondered, sort of like, what was were there any obstacles within the newsroom to overcome, and has the Times like set up a protocol for dealing with these kinds of things? I know that some newspapers, some news organizations have started to do that kind of thing as nonprofit funding becomes a greater force in for-profit newspapers.
I think initially it was less a concern because, I mean, the Pulitzer Center is a bunch of journalists, and you know they know what we do and they understand it, and like, you know, I don't even know where their funding comes from, but the funding they get, you know, they tell their funders, you're never going to get word one to say about what happens here. So, I mean, that, I think for us, we sort of looked at it as like it's not much different than advertising in a newspaper. There have been other folks in our newsroom who have come up with grant ideas from organizations that have either an agenda or some, and you know, that right now they're still figuring it out.
They are, and you know, like the Solutions Journalism through this group in New York City, I mean, Bill and Melinda Gates directly gives the money to them, and then it's almost like they launder the money back to us. But we can't get the money directly from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation because then they're in our backyard. We can't do that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of consternation in the Seattle Times newsroom about whether or not that by itself is crossing a line. I think the fact that it's about education and there's still there's no input from outside on what they're writing about. I mean, they're basically, you know, go find people who are finding ways to fix education and write stories about that and see what works and what doesn't. So I don't think there's no sort of tit for tat kind of concern, but it's just the very idea that, you know, we're taking money that is essentially a gift from Bill Gates.
It's not defined, so.
I mean, they're struggling with it for sure.
We have time for just a couple more questions, if you want to. On wall, you got beat.
Hi, I'm a Stanford sophomore, and as someone who's very environmentally conscious, it's so frustrating to me to see how polarized the responses to reporting on things like climate change often become. Did you see a similar polarization in the responses to this piece? And if you didn't, what do you think made this different from other environmental reporting?
That's actually a great question.
Yeah.
It was a little different, in part because so much of it focused on Alaska, and a lot of the fishing industry in Alaska is conservative, not particularly sort of environmentally conscious, but they're seeing the changes themselves. And you know, I interviewed a guy who was the former Republican Senate Majority Leader in the legislature in Alaska, and he said, this global warming thing is a bunch of hooey, but ocean acidification is real. Yeah. And I mean, he's quoted in the story. So I think that people just view it differently.
Hi, my name is Anne Hoa-Chung. I'm a French journalist. I'm a Knight Fellow, just like Charla and some bunch of people.
Congratulations.
Well, my question, in fact, I work mostly on ecology and science topics. And so my question is about, well, in France, environment journalism has known way better days. For example, a newspaper like Le Monde shrunk its environment pages to almost nothing. And personally, I have a hard time convincing usually my editors and so on to do big reports, cover stories about climate change or ocean acidification. So you partly answer this question, but well, you were lucky to have a direct supervisor who was an environment journalist before. But well, how did environment journalism evolve in the US this last decade?
Well, we've been cutting beats for a long time in the news business. And you'll see art critics. I mean, we're trimming our news coverage incredibly, and unfortunately, part of that is the science writers, environmental writers, and it's hard to imagine not still reporting on that, but I know it's happened at the Seattle Times, and our medical reporter, he's gone. I mean, and so, I mean, I'm not sure where to lead how to answer your question, but it's the economics of the business.
Well, I think one of the driving influences on why you see less environmental reporting, especially in big newspapers, is, as Ken alluded to, science these days has boomed. There's so much science being done, and it's going by leaps and bounds in conceptual levels that I find an incredible timidity on the part of my editors quite often about how they don't know how to judge what I write because they don't have a sense of it, and they don't. And my fellow journalists and you guys might completely think do this the wrong way, but because I write a lot about science, and I'm really having to ask scientists like Ken, well, can you explain that to me? I pretty much always show a scientist like Ken what I wrote about what he said before I give it to my editor. Now, when I've worked with the New York Times and their fact-checking department, and they think I'm crazy, like, you don't show your sources what you're writing. But I think I have to, because the subjects are too complex for me to be sure that I got the nuances or that I got it right in the right context. And I view that interchange with that scientist as an opportunity for me to do a better job. But I see, and I've just had to, and I just give huge volumes of notes and source materials to editors. But it's almost too much for them to have to, and they don't have a sense of how it works themselves. So that I think they just, but then on the other hand, if you, like we probably all do who are interested in this, have Twitter feeds and get news feeds from different kinds of organizations that publish scientific information all day long. So it's really the main newspapers that are going smaller on it. But there is more than enough information out there if you want to find it. If you get the Science Daily, it'll take you half the morning to read through the headlines.
Okay, I think we have time for one final question. And Anhua, it helps that in Seattle area there are a bunch of crunchy hippies. So environmental stories are welcome in Seattle area.
Mary Ellen, as you look at the interface between citizens and scientists, you're looking at citizens feeding out science. Have you looked at scientists feeding back to citizens instead of a citizen science, maybe a scientist citizen, or even to take this one, make it totally ecological, a journalism, citizen journalist sort of effort?
Well, that's a great question. I have just finished the first draft of a manuscript about citizen science, and it is 450 pages long. And I really actually kept back 30 pages that I still want to get in there. And part of it is because of looking at this in this big way. There is the citizen, there's the idea of regular people doing science, and that has its own issues. But then there's a whole big field of citizen science that's about co-created projects. And so it's not me, scientist, you, grunt worker, giving me data, but actually scientists working with a group of people and saying, what are our mutual questions that we want to ask together here? Like, I want to get this out of this work. What do you want to get out of this work? This is happening in anthropology and archaeology, happening in local communities. It's a very big focus of a lot of the educational research and pushing forward of citizen science to have a social justice issue, really about kind of taking apart the hierarchy that science has been part of, but without compromising the importance of getting data in a way that is reliable and not just observational. That wasn't a very good ending answer, but yes, looking at it from all points of view. And I would like to see more citizen journalists, actually, people reporting what they see. Citizen scientists quite often are citizen journalists. They are writing in and saying, you know, the sea star wasting is an example. The scuba diver off the coast of Seattle, she saw it happening, and she photographed it, and she reported it. And she's a citizen scientist and a citizen journalist.
All right, well, if anyone has any additional questions, this is where it gets fun. We're going to mix and mingle. There's a little lobby reception out there, and let's go ahead and give our panelists a big round of applause.